So yes, I'd like to welcome you all to today's talk, which is generally supported by the UVA's East Asia Center as part of their spring speaker series. So today we have the privilege of hearing from Professor David Fedman, who is a historian of Japan and Korea, specializing in environmental history and historical geography of Japanese imperialism. He received his PhD from Stanford University in 2015 and is currently an assistant professor at the University of California, Irvine. He is the author of Seeds of Control, Japan's Empire of Forestry in Colonial Korea, which he'll be presenting about today. And I should say that Seeds of Control has generated a lot of excitement in the field. Professor Fedman's have all these back-to-back book talks and panels, including one that he was on just before he joined us today. And it's been racking up all these prizes too. It was recently named winner of the American Historical Association Pacific Coast Branch Book Award. And it was also a finalist for the George Perkins Marsh Prize from the American Society for Environmental History. And I wouldn't be surprised if other honors are forthcoming. And Professor Fedman, together with geographer Carrie Caracas, am I saying Carrie's name right?
Close enough.
Okay. He's also, together they're engaged in an ongoing collaborative research project on the firebombing of Japanese cities during World War II. And since 2012, they also have maintained JapanAirRaids.org, a bilingual digital archive dedicated to the dissemination of primary sources related to the strategic bombing of Japan during World War II. And finally, I should note that Professor Fedman is also just a wonderful and generous human being. He's been a mentor for me ever since our graduate school days. When he first suggested I pursue the topic that became the subject of my dissertation on my own first book project. So it was my pleasure to help invite him to speak at UVA today. So without further ado, Professor Fedman.
Well, thank you very much. Let me start with a word of thanks to the East Asia Center, and in particular to Brian Murphy for facilitating everything. And of course, a word of thanks to Professor Seeley. I've had the great fortune of getting to know and work with Joseph over the years, and I really value his input and his friendship. And so I'm really just grateful for the invitation and the very kind introduction. So bear with me here for a moment while I pull up my slides. Are we good? Can you, Joseph, can you confirm that you can see them? Okay. So I am, well, I'd be remiss not to point out that I am a native Virginian. I grew up in Arlington, just outside of DC, but I spent all of my summers in a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, some 60 miles southwest of your beautiful campus. So while I've grown accustomed to remote delivery of lectures, this one really pains me to not have in person. I really do miss Virginia. Charlottesville is a beautiful place. And those mountains that surround it have a special place in my heart. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to introduce in very broad strokes my somewhat recently published book, Seeds of Control, Japan's Empire of Forestry in Colonial Korea. The book is wide-ranging. I mean, I really try to cover a lot of ground and pack it into a couple of hundred pages. So I'm not going to dig all that deeply into each and every topic with the hopes that we can, I'll introduce a lot of them, but with the hopes that we can kind of dig in a little bit more deeply in our Q&A, and also with the hopes that perhaps you might buy and read the book to learn more. So I want to begin with a few words about the origins of the project itself, which trace back not to a library, not to an archive, but to trails, mountain trails in Japan. I'm an avid hiker and backpacker, and I used to be a rock climber, and I would take whatever opportunity I could find to get into the uplands in Japan. I was fortunate right out of undergrad to have an opportunity to live in Hokkaido, the northernmost island of Japan, to research the history of mountaineering, alpinism in Japan. And it was in this context that I was first exposed to a relentless stream of commentary about Japan's national forest culture, sort of these ideas about the unique relationship that the Japanese people had historically had with the mountains and forests that have nourished the Japanese spirit for centuries. These were interesting, thought-provoking ideas, but they were also fundamentally at odds with what I was reading at the time about the role of Japanese corporations in clear-cutting Southeast Asian forests. Across the 90s and really into the present day, Japan has stood at the forefront of efforts to extract timber from places like Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia. And so there was, I was fascinated by this tension between these sort of nationalistic claims to a unique and deep reverence for and stewardship of forests on the islands themselves, but also kind of a obfuscation or a lack of awareness of the role that Japan was playing in the degradation of landscapes beyond the archipelago itself. That tension was always there, and it had always fascinated me. Fast forward a couple of years, and I had as a graduate student, I had my first opportunity to live in South Korea, in Seoul. And it was there that I encountered strikingly similar narratives, for one thing, about Koreans' own relationship with their forests. The Japanese invoked the sakura, the cherry blossom. The Koreans invoked the pine and saw that as something woven into the fiber of what it meant to be Korean. At the same time, whilst living in Seoul and talking with friends, colleagues, and fellow hikers, I also encountered a great deal of commentary and really animosity about the role that Japan had played during the period of colonial rule in the exploitation and degradation of Korea's own forests. In the eyes of just about every Korean that I spoke with, the Japanese colonial rule from 1895 roughly to 1945 had been kind of singularly extractive and destructive. The Japanese, in their stories, were hell-bent on clear-cutting every last forest and taking advantage of whatever resources they could get their hands on. As I got into the archive as a graduate student trying to kind of formulate my dissertation project, I began to realize that that's just really not the case. It may apply to the wartime mobilization of the Korean Peninsula from 1937 to 45. The Japanese did harvest Korea's forests, and the nature of forestry was extractive. But up until that point, the Japanese were very vigorous in the planting of trees. Reforestation, the regeneration of landscapes was central to the colonial forestry project. And so I began to recognize that another task before me was to restore some of that complexity to kind of popular narratives, public memory of the history and legacies of Japanese colonial rule, to reveal that forestry in general and silviculture, planting trees in particular, was central to Japanese environmental rule. And we don't, to suggest that the Japanese were earnest in their efforts to plant trees is not to diminish the nature of colonial violence, it's to reveal a new register of colonial violence, to show how the greening of landscapes was in and of itself a vector of coercion and social control. That's an argument that really lies at the heart of the book. It's something that I'll circle back to momentarily. Now, I've gotten ahead of myself a little bit here. Step into any bookstore and you are liable to encounter entire shelves of commentary, books on books about Japan's, what I call Japan's Sylvan exceptionalism, notions of a national forest culture. These have a great deal of currency in Japanese society to this day, these sort of popular understandings. But it wasn't just Japanese language texts that were espousing these views. I also began to hear remarkably similar commentary from scholars writing in English about the nature of Japan's own forest history. And I began to recognize that a lot of them were turning to the groundbreaking work of Conrad Topman, this book, The Green Archipelago. It's a foundational study of Japanese environmental history. It's a wonderfully and brilliantly researched study of pre-modern forestry that reveals this really rich tradition of forest regeneration in pre-industrial Japan, looking at the Tokugawa period in particular. But I began to detect sort of a projection forward of this silvicultural savvy that a lot of folks were turning to this book and the idea of the Green Archipelago to hold up and celebrate Japan's sustainability and eco-friendly nature writ large. So some of what I wanted to do with this book was also to kind of push back a little bit against this idea of the Green Archipelago, to show how it transformed into the 20th century, and especially to look beyond the islands themselves. So one of the central claims of my book is that in order to understand the verdancy, the lush forest coverage that defines the Japanese landscape to this very day, you have to look beyond the islands themselves, to the landscapes that have fallen under the control of Japan historically, whether as part of the colonial empire up until 1945, or as part of this more informal expansion and control into Southeast Asia through Japanese logging companies in the post-war period. And that takes us into the present. So methodologically, I'm sort of making a case for why historians and environmental historians more generally need to write empire more fully into Japanese environmental history, and why the Japanese empire needs to be on the map of global environmental historians. So the book, part of what drew me further to forests as a subject of study and forestry more generally is its multifaceted nature. Forestry is not just about sustainable yields in the hinterlands. It has implications for everyday life. It's not just a rural concern. Insofar as urbanites needed charcoal and other biofuels to keep their houses warm, it was of concern to everyone in the Korean Peninsula, be they urban or rural, Japanese or Korean. And so this book is kind of an attempt to capture the multiple dimensions of the forestry project. It's organized, the chapters are organized thematically. So each chapter kind of takes on a different register of the colonial forestry project. I hope that it also has a clear-cut chronology and moves us forward in time, but I thought I might just sort of walk you through some of the themes, some of the different approaches that I take to getting at this forestry project in its many different forms and its many different implications. So for example, in the second chapter of the book, I look very carefully at the place of forests and the landscape more generally in the growth and transformation of the geographical imagination of Japanese settlers, Japanese officials, and even Westerners who were traveling to Korea during this period. Forests were a marker of national decline in the eyes of Japanese settler colonists. They routinely pointed to the degradation of the Korean landscape to further justify their own occupation of the peninsula. They pointed to things like the Hageyama, the bald mountains that purportedly defined the southernmost provinces, as evidence of the mismanagement, the maladministration of the Korean government across the Chosun period. But also they went a step further to level allegations of moral depravity, that the Korean people were constitutionally incapable of being conservation-minded. These are, of course, bigoted assumptions in many cases. They are used to uphold a racial hierarchy and subordinate the Korean people so as to kind of justify Japan's colonial tutelage in Korea. So nature writing, maps, photographs, and other visual representations of the Korean landscape are all important because they were taken together. They were part of kind of a discursive construction of Korea's landscape that helped advance Japan's colonial takeover in ways that I describe in the book. One of the real challenges for me as a researcher was to parse the rhetoric from the reality. Of a lot of the Japanese settler descriptions of the landscapes that they encountered are exaggerated, they're hyperbolic, and they're totally self-serving. Of course, they were going to play up deforestation and the inability of ordinary Koreans to conserve their own landscapes. That was directly in their own interest in terms of staking a claim to the land for themselves. However, there's also very compelling evidence in the archive in many different forms that by the time the Japanese annexed the Korean peninsula in 1910, it was heavily denuded, especially in the densely populated south, the corridor from Busan to Seoul. So we need to appreciate that the Japanese were not kind of fantastical in pointing out that deforestation was rampant. It was a severe problem in the late Chosun period as well. So I devote some attention in the book to trying to figure out deforestation across the 19th century and how it plays into the kind of decline of the Chosun state itself. There's one exception to this kind of declensionist narrative, and that's the northern provinces of Korea, especially the Yalu River Basin that Professor Seeley knows much more about than I. In the eyes of the colonial government, it's in the north that this great sylvan treasure house resides, dense primary forests that await the timber industrialist. So this chapter is called Korea Green and Red. Green being a nod to kind of this forest Eden, these lush, untouched forests that were a reminder of the kind of the great forests that once were. And so this chapter is kind of a discursive exploration of how Japanese and Westerners more generally marked the Korean peninsula and its landscape. From there, I go into great detail about the politics of woodland tenure rights and land redistribution, the effort on the part of the colonial government to redraw the maps, the titles of who owns what woodland on what terms. The Japanese wasted no time in launching a set of forest surveys that fundamentally transformed the ownership of forests across the peninsula. And in so doing, they defined not just who owned the land, but how the land was used. So this process is very much at the foundation of the kind of policies that are rolled out by the colonial administration to better control land use. And it is, if anything, the engine for woodland expropriation. One of the most distinctive features of this system and this process of woodland redistribution is this mechanism of land lease afforestation. Essentially, the colonial government leases out land to any interested party that is willing to undertake rapid reforestation, to plant millions of seeds and saplings, and with the promise that if they kind of meet the state's criteria, ownership of the land will then be transferred in perpetuity. Essentially, this is the colonial state outsourcing the heavy lifting of reforestation to corporations, capitalists, and settlers, a vast majority of them being Japanese. So if there is a kind of a driver, a funnel through which the colonial state siphons off land and pushes the Korean people, agrarian communities in particular, off of the lands, the common lands to which they had long enjoyed access, it's this land lease reforestation system. This process, of course, is rife with conflict. The Korean people do not just accept this sitting down. As I show in this chapter, they also push back considerably. It touches off protests, uprisings even. And so I in this chapter, I also make an effort to better understand kind of the social strife that is engendered by this process. But the writing of the land is so crucial at the level of policy, and it bears on just about every other aspect of the forestry project to follow. And it takes a lot longer than the bureaucrats that I write about expected. It drags on for years, in part because it's just so much more complicated and fraught than they ever could have imagined. I devote a chapter to science. I look at the relationship between Japanese and Korean ecologists and botanists and forestry engineers to reveal a type of colonial collaboration that we seldom consider, kind of laboratory collaboration. I argue that Koreans, despite their marginalized place in kind of the halls of power, the kind of colonial institutions, they were absolutely vital to the success of the scientific enterprise. And they played a much more central role than their kind of marginalized titles suggest. So in this chapter, I look at 4 scientists in particular, 2 Japanese, 2 Korean, to better understand kind of the interpersonal dynamics and uneven power structures that shaped the scientific agenda of the colonial state. I also make the point that these scientists had a great deal of influence in determining what was planted where. If anyone got to really decide the ecological signature of colonial rule, what sorts of trees would be planted in what ecosystems to what ends, it was the scientists who staffed these research stations created by the colonial government. And so I also kind of map out the process through which they engineered growth on their own terms in Korea. And to my surprise, this was not a process of kind of imposing flora from Japan and abroad upon the Korean landscape. They were very much of the mind that before launching large-scale reforestation projects, they needed to know more about the material realities of the Korean peninsula to better understand the climatic features of the peninsula, the soil conditions. So they are very energetic early on in their efforts to better understand the ecosystems of Korea before cementing policies and scaling up their approaches to reforestation. Forestry is more than a utilitarian undertaking. Forests are meaningful not just because they furnish products of all sorts, fuel, board sheets, tannins, fruit, fibers, and so on. They're also really important symbols at a symbolic level. They're freighted with meaning. And so I dedicate another chapter to kind of the ideological register of forestry, to better understand the various ways in which Korea's forests and their stewardship were woven into colonial era discourses about ethnic and cultural assimilation in Korea. Central to this discussion is the concept of Irvine Shiso, forest love thought or ideology, this kind of long-standing discourse in Japan that suggested the kind of rich and timeless traditions of forest reverence and stewardship that had defined, that was woven into the fabric of what it meant to be Japanese, and was also incorporated into Shinto rites and rituals. Forestry was very much an instrument for emperor-centered nationalism during this period. And so in chapter 7 of the book, I look at kind of some of the rites and rituals surrounding this forest love thought. It entailed a great deal of sylvan pageantry. Each April, Koreans from across the peninsula would be, it is nap time in the Fedman household, as one might expect. There is going to be some drama. So forgive me for that. Bear with me here while Mama maybe gets them under control. It's a challenge these days. We just celebrated yesterday Earth Day, and there are all sorts of kind of celebration of going green and being green. Well, something similar unfolded in the colonial context in Korea. Each April the 3rd, Koreans would participate in massive ritual tree plantings that were in celebration of the emperor. They were tending to the emperor's garden, was sometimes how it was framed. And so these sorts of rites and rituals are also an essential component of the colonial forestry project. And I try to kind of bring them to life by offering portraits of forestry exhibitions, of ritual plantings, of kind of the cultural undertakings and components that colored everyday life. Radio programs, drawings and arts, films. Forestry infused cultural production during this period as well. And this was very deliberate on the part of Japanese forestry bureaucrats, who saw a big part of their mission as being kind of to inculcate Korean subjects with a Japanese appreciation of nature, Japanizing the environmental ethics of Koreans. Of course, this is shot through with contradiction, this idea. At the same time that that Japanese officials and ideologues are invoking Pan-Asian solidarity and fraternity with their Korean brothers in conservation, they're also upholding a racial hierarchy at which the Japanese sit at the pinnacle. So I also try to kind of recognize in this chapter that forest love thought is in its own right this very much fraught and shot through with tension and contradiction. I devote a considerable amount of attention in the book to the material implications and inputs of colonial rule as well. And in the final chapter of the book, I look at the wartime period. In particular, the wartime centralization of forest commodities, forest resources, the development from 1937 to 1945 of a command economy for forest products, forest commodities, things like timber, charcoal, synthetic fibers that were in increasing demand to fight the holy war on the Asian continent. This process has profound implications for the harvesting and conservation of Korea's forests. They are mobilized for the war and to a significant degree cut down in service of the war. But this process also has bodily implications. And that's one of the things I try to reveal in this chapter, to show how tightening control over things like charcoal shaped the everyday and corporeal experience of wintertime in Korea. For those of you who have spent time in Korea in the winter, you appreciate how bone-piercingly cold conditions can get when those winter winds cut through the peninsula. So access to fuel is not a trivial or trifling matter. It is essential to survival in severe winter conditions. So this chapter is also an effort to kind of think through different, more structural forms of colonial violence, to look beyond some of the things we think of as being kind of the cardinal sins or the most oppressive facets of Japanese colonial rule, to reveal more subtle forms of colonial power and violence. Those things like fuel scarcity and what that meant for the day-to-day lives of people just trying to stay warm and keep their bellies full in a frigid climate. So this chapter looks at the wartime, but it also tries to advance kind of a new approach to thinking about the nature of colonial violence and wartime and total war in the Korean Peninsula. So that's kind of a quick walk through some of the themes that I explore in the book, but I want to now key you into the what I see as kind of being the four major arguments that run across all of these chapters. Everything that I just touched on in one way or another is kind of working to advance four broad claims that I hope are kind of the main takeaways from the book, what I see as being kind of the interventions that I'm trying to make in the field, and in a few different fields, not just Korean studies or Japanese studies, but environmental history, global environmental history more generally. I really aspired for this book to speak to multiple audiences, to be written beyond Korean studies. And I'll let you be the judge of how successful I am in that enterprise. One of the kind of core arguments of the book is about the nature of state power and social control in the colonial context. I was struck at every stage of my research and writing of this book by how frequently the foresters who populate my account struggled to implement their agenda. This is not a story of unilateral imposition of their blueprint for forestry or forestry reforms. They repeatedly failed and had to regroup and were sent back to their drawing boards as they reckoned with environmental, geopolitical, and market forces that were beyond their control. And this struck me as being somewhat at odds with especially Korean language accounts I had read, I had encountered about an all-knowing, an omnipotent, monolithic colonial state, the Ilcheha, that kind of executed the will of officialdom with ruthless efficiency. And that's just not the story that emerges when viewed through the lens of the Bureau of Forestry. So one of the things I'm really trying to do in this book is to offer a new face to colonial officialdom. I go out of my way to write about particular foresters, to kind of frame the forestry enterprise in terms of the people, the architects behind it, to note their personal failings, their biases, their careerist aspirations, and how they colored the forestry project. And I think this just generally adds a touch of human complexity to the colonial state itself. And it also offers a way, I think, to rethink and to move beyond ideas about scientific forestry and the central being imposed from on high. The state itself having a kind of operating in lockstep and a unified vision. The forestry project in Korea was beset by internal discord. Foresters did not themselves see eye to eye about some of their reforms. Corporations played a huge role in shaping the nature of the reform agenda. So all of these things, I think, play an important role in, or offer an opportunity to kind of rethink, puzzle through, and add some nuance to our understanding of the operation of state power. I'd also add that forests are a fruitful way, in my mind, to assess the limits, the edges of state power in colonial Korea. If there were any spaces that were recalcitrant to colonial control, it's those that fell under the jurisdiction of the Colonial Bureau of Forestry. Forests, as Professor Seeley can tell you better than most, are spaces of stalwart resistance and insurgency during the period of colonial rule, especially those in the north that abut the Yalu River Basin. These were spaces from which guerrillas staged their insurgency, where smugglers operated with impunity. So to examine the colonial state from the timberline, I think, is a reminder of some of the limits of state power, and is a pushback against kind of these conceptions of the colonial state as being all powerful. So I like generally enjoy using these hinterlands to kind of reassess and better gauge the limits of state authority in Korea. And this, I think, helps us move beyond an urban bias that is pervasive in Korean studies. There's been to the extent that scholars writing in English have looked at colonial Korea, they've written a lot about colonial modernity, primarily in urban areas. To the extent they've looked at the countryside, they've looked at arable land holdings, wet rice agriculture, the intensification of rice production. Very seldom have they looked beyond the rice paddy to the mountains and forests that comprise over 70% of the peninsula. So mountains and woodlands are the defining feature of Korea's landmass, and I think it's high time that they get their historiographical due. The book is an attempt to better appreciate and recognize the materiality of modernization. Scholars have written a great deal about the implications of Japanese settler colonialism and kind of industrial development for the built environment of the Korean Peninsula. They routinely take note of the thickening web of railways that work its way through the peninsula and into Manchuria and beyond. They write about the development of settler enclaves and the influx of hundreds of thousands of settlers and the material demands, but seldom do they pay attention to the material inputs, the kind of the commodities that were essential to all of these projects. So this book, Seeds of Control, tries to map out the circulation of resources, the transformation of forests into the commodities that circulated not just across the Korean Peninsula, but across the empire as a whole. The book is fundamentally about Korea, but you cannot understand the forestry project without looking beyond the peninsula itself. Korea's own forests and forest resources were circulating, especially into Manchuria over the 1930s and into the wartime period, and to a lesser extent back to Japan. So we have to map out these commodity chains and resource flows to understand the politics that shaped them. One material, I'd say I pay attention to one material more than the rest: fuel. Fuel is hugely important, as I mentioned before, to the lived experience of colonial rule. It's something of interest to houses rich and poor, urban and rural, and it sits very much at the heart of kind of politics over access to the forest. At the center of these politics sits the ondol, these heated floors that are conventional to Korean dwellings, that in the eyes of the colonial state were ground zero of deforestation. So I also look in the book at the process through which colonial foresters set out to fundamentally transform the domestic sphere, to take control over Korean housewives' cooking patterns and sleeping patterns and the material trappings of the home itself, to better appreciate the material dimensions of forestry reforms. I don't know how this slide got in there. I make an argument. A third core argument of the book is about the very nature of reforestation itself. I argue for, I suggest that the story of colonial forestry in Korea and silviculture reveals a darker shade of green. We have to recognize that the colonial state was earnest in its effort to plant trees, at least until 1937, but that those plantings were themselves really important vehicles and instruments for the expropriation of land and so greater social control over colonial society. This is an argument that I hope has implications that extend well beyond the Korean context. We live in a time when scientists, environmentalists, government officials are calling for massive tree planting reforestation schemes as a check against climate change, global warming. And I'm all for that, but I also think that, I think my book suggests that we would do well to think carefully about the uneven power dynamics of reforestation, to think critically about the tree planting at what cost to which people, the overall kind of the ground level consequences of reforestation. We tend to think of greening landscapes as being a singularly good thing, and if colonial Korea is any indication, that's not always the case. It's more complicated than that, and we need to think about on whose backs reforestation is carried. The last kind of set of claims that I try to advance in the book is about the Japanese empire of forestry as a whole. Studies of the Japanese empire tend to be, in English, I should say, Anglophone studies, tend to compartmentalize the empire. There's been a lot written about the Japanese empire, especially of late, but it tends to be focused on one part of the colony, a study of colonial Korea or Manchuria or Taiwan. And that's perfectly understandable. But I also think that we gain a lot when we better look at the empire as a whole and try to understand the interconnections between different parts of the empire. So I attempt to do a little bit of that in the book as well, to better understand the friction between Korea and Manchuria, for example, who are routinely at loggerheads over timber tariffs and the timber industry more generally. But I also think looking at the empire of forestry as a whole is important because we need to appreciate the fact that Japan has historically had an outsized influence on forests across the Pacific Rim, be they as part of the colonial empire before 1945 or in Southeast Asia thereafter, into the present. If we are to understand more fully the kind of ecological footprint of Japan across the 20th century, then we need to not only look beyond the Japanese islands, but look across up and down the Pacific Rim. And so this book also kind of urges readers to look beyond 1945 to understand the politics of Japanese forestry operations in the Asia Pacific writ large. Which brings us to the question of legacies. Kind of, if you were to travel to South Korea today, I think you would see few indications of the colonial forestry project that once was. But if you look a little bit more carefully and critically, I think you'll see a good number of ways in which the colonial forestry project is actually, inscribed in the South Korean forest landscape into the present. South Korea today is smothered in foliage, thanks in large part to what South Korean scholars often describe as Park Chung-hee's forest miracle. Over the course of the 60s and 70s, reforestation proceeded at a furious pace as part of Park's rural revitalization campaign that kind of defined his strand of kind kind of developmental authoritarianism. Some folks might call it a developmental dictatorship. He brought a sort of military ethos to bear on the project of reforesting and rejuvenating the landscape from decades of foreign occupation and war. The Korean War also ravaged the forest landscape. I don't address that nearly as much as I would like to in the book, but it's important to note that here. And while this forest miracle is presented to the South Korean people as being sort of a indigenization, a recuperation of the landscape from all the harm that was done by the Japanese, it is in many ways breathing new life into the very same sets of policies that the colonial state had implemented before it. In its concern with Sweden agriculture, its efforts to control the fuel economy of the home and the ondo, its planting, its prioritization of erosion, its social engineering and resettlement of Hwajonmin. In so many different ways, it is drawing on the kind of colonial era blueprint. So here we have a case of different ruling regimes with strikingly similar management goals, using forestry and silviculture as a form of social control. So I see in South Korea some really important continuities in environmental governance that run across the 20th century that I think we need to take seriously. And this is an argument that I think a lot of South Koreans chafe at, to suggest that there's any relationship between Pak and the colonial state is to kind of venture into the morass of the colonial legacy question. I'm not suggesting here that the greening of Korea, its foliage today, is because of colonial rule, far from it. But I do think we need to take the continuities, be they interpersonal. Some of the colonial scientists who were trained under the colonial state go on to play a central role in the greening of Korea under Park Chung-hee. The material continuities and legacies, the same sorts of trees and seeds and saplings that the colonial state initially planted, are used in large scale by Pak and his reforestation advisors. For all of these reasons, I think we need to think more broadly, capaciously, about the place of forestry and reforestation across the 20th century in Korea. And here you can see the fruits of Korea's forest miracle under Park Chung-hee. This is, I think, over the span of 20 years, you can see the transformation of bald mountains into green hills. And this is widely celebrated as being a pillar of Pak's kind of conservationist ethos, at the same time that he was implementing staggering industrial economic growth. Acacia being the one of the material carryovers, just as the colonial state used acacia in large scale, so did Park Chung-hee and the Bureau, the Forestry Service in South Korea. North Korea is much more difficult to assess. I don't say nearly as much as I wish I could have in the book about post-war, post-colonial North Korea. In part, it's the constraints of the archive. It's much harder to get at some of these questions, the implementation and conception of forest policy. But there's no denying the central role that forests and silviculture and the arboreal charisma plays in propping up the heads of state themselves. From here we have the Kim family dynasty, from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un, all participating in very similar kind of pageants and rites and rituals that are used to help kind of prop up their place in North Korean society as the great forest wardens of the realm. They are leading the North Korean people in an effort to protect and conserve and sustain the soil. Of course, anyone who was watching Korea in the 1990s through the arduous March famine, and who has an eye on the perennial floods, recognizes that there are serious limitations to these greening campaigns. There's a lot more that can be said about North Korea, but that's not really the subject of my book, as important a topic as it is. The last thing I want to simply point out is that the Japanese empire of forestry has not disappeared. Part of why this story matters is that it is playing out in the forests of Southeast Asia to this day. And while the optics of a Swidden farmer in Jola province and a tenant farmer in Kalimantan in Papua New Guinea don't seem strikingly different, they are wrestling with kind of the same sets of politics and power relations. I would point you to this controversy, the recent controversy over the sourcing of timber for the, well, they were the 2020 Olympics. They're now the question mark Olympics. Just to give you a sense that the issues surrounding the sourcing of timber, Japan's heavy reliance, dependence on the importation of timber from abroad, so-called gaizai, timber from the outside, is a huge part of the kind of transformation of the Japanese empire of forestry into the present day. Japan still, though you wouldn't know it because of the kind of trade mechanisms at work, Japanese corporations, Itochu, Sumitomo Mitsui, all have their hands on logging operations and plywood manufacture, and are heavily invested in forestry projects across Southeast Asia. And so we need to think about some of the continuities of the Japanese empire into the post-war period, and especially the relationship between Japan and Southeast Asia, which is only going to grow more important as I think as time passes. So truly the last thing I'll say is I just want to nod to my next project, which is carved out of this one. One of my pieces of research moving forward is to write about the Oji Paper Company, which I think really encapsulates everything I just discussed in one corporation. It's a Japanese paper company that has historically been at the forefront of the control and consumption of forest resources across Asia. It had factories it had 43 factories spread across Taiwan, Manchuria, Korea, Indonesia, and elsewhere. So I'm hoping to write a book that offers new insights into the material underpinnings of Japan's much celebrated print culture through the lens of a single corporation, one that has operations presently to this very day across Asia. So Oji and its own empire of paper or pulp is alive and well. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides here.
Well, thank you so much, David, for that fascinating, rich presentation. And if you haven't read the book yet, all of you, I just go out and buy it. There's just so much more, so much that was just hinted at in this presentation that is explicated in much greater detail in the book itself. And it's just truly fascinating, so many different aspects. And encourage you all, we have some time for questions, to go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A. Just type out your question into the QA, and then I can read that out to the audience, and then Professor Fedman can go ahead and answer that. But I just have, could I just humor you with one question of my own really quick, David? I just was wondering, and we see some questions coming in the QA, so this is great, so please type in your questions, but I was just wondering if you'd briefly speak about the spiritual importance of trees and woodlands to Koreans in colonial Korea. Because we get a sense from your presentation of the ideological importance of forests to the colonial state, and imposition of these Japanese forms of, tree reverence, if you will. We saw the photograph of the Shinto ceremony taking place. So I just wondering if you could briefly, and I don't want you to spend too much time on my question because we have some questions coming in, but talk about how Koreans themselves understood the spiritual importance of trees and woodland spaces.
Thank you for the question. It's a hugely important one. I regret having not really mentioned it even in passing. Forests are hugely important and meaningful, significant to the Korean people. There are rich traditions of shamanism, of geomancy in Korea that stretch back into the Chosun period, that have long shaped the rites and rituals of agrarian and village life in across the peninsula. So for different hamlets, trees were they could be auspicious. Their budding would determine the arrival of a new child, or conversely, the threat of a new flood. Farming households, rural households, paid a great deal of attention to the rhythms of the forest that surrounded them. So absolutely, they carry different kind of spiritual valences in that way. But I would say the most important dimension to this is burial practices in Korea. Traditionally, Korean families, be they Yangban aristocrats or lowly farmers, would try to lay their ancestors to rest in geomantically propitious burial mounds in mountains and forests. And the kind of politics of determining getting access to forest land for the purpose of burial is they're deeply contentious process. It has a history that goes back hundreds of years. There's a great deal of antagonism between the Chosun state and its officials who are trying to get larger plots of land to pay respects to their lineages. And so when we're talking about the redistribution of woodlands, we're not just talking about resource politics. In the eyes of colonial Korean communities, these are their ancestral burial lands. And ancestor worship is hugely important in Korean society. So this just adds a layer of significance and intensity to these politics. What's at stake is not just access to fuel and timber and fodder. It's also being able to worship and sustain the burial mounds of one's kin, one's descent group. And that's no small matter. And I think that's part of what it helps explain the intensity of the pushback from certain sectors of agrarian society.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I just had a sense that, of course, that these burial spaces were incredibly important and the ways in which Koreans connected with mountains and hillsides and forests. And so I'm glad you're able to sort of expound on that more for the sake of our audience. But let's go to some of our questions that have been coming in. So first we have from Amber Bullock. How many of Korea's forests are natural? When did Japan begin forestation in their own country, when it resulted in Japan having very little natural forests?
Well, that's true. I mean, and of course, how we define natural is in its own right a very complicated topic that scientists continue to debate into the present. But I totally agree that in Japan, there's very little in the way of what we might think of as being native or primary forest. There's a fascinating history to be written about the role of plantation forestry, especially in the post-war period. For those of you who have been to Japan in the spring, your seasonal allergies might have alerted you to the preponderance of sugi, of cedar, which is a direct result of efforts led by the US occupation of Japan to rapidly reforest through the cheapest and most expeditious means possible. And that was to plant massive plantations of cedar in particular. And this is to the detriment of ecological diversity in Japan. The question of Korea is harder to say. I'm not as familiar with kind of the deep history. There is a fascinating history being written right now by our colleague John Lee about the history of pine monoculture in Korea. So looking back at the Chosun period, sort of pre-industrial Korean society, there, for a good number of reasons that John Lee explains in great depth, the Chosun state prioritized the planting of red pine above all else. So to look at kind of the evolution of forest cover up until the 19th century, it really is a process of kind of a movement towards the monocultures of red pine. And that too is at the detriment of ecological diversity of other forms of native trees, shrubs, grasses, and so on. So I do think that's one dynamic that's at work. I can't give you a percentage, unfortunately, but I do think that it's my sense is it's a relatively small percentage because of the domination of things of red pine, of pine trees more generally. But it's a really fascinating question. Part of what draws me to the Korean Peninsula as an environmental historian are just the layers of occupation. The Japanese come in and plant a certain way. The Americans come in 1945 and are concerned with the deforested state of the landscape, and they plant. They have their own set of planting reforestation priorities. Those are then then Pak Chung-hee comes in. So there are kind of layers inscribed into the landscape itself, and that's just inherently fascinating as an environmental historian.
Great. So let's move on to the next question. So this is from Professor Fred McDamon, who is a colleague of ours in the anthropology department here at UVA. And he says, towards the beginning, you spoke of the Japanese seeing the bald mountains in Korea and condemning that. Was that the Japanese seeing China in Korea?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but yes, there is a direct linkage in the eyes and minds, not just of Japanese, but of Westerners more generally, between deforestation, kind of the poor state of the landscape, and the historical influence of China and its kind of Confucian foundations that it had on Korea. So that they sometimes explicitly lay blame for deforestation, the mismanagement of the landscape at the feet of the Chosun government, at the feet of the Yangban. But they go a step further to suggest that this is rooted in kind of the slavish adherence to Confucianism, and that if Korea and Koreans are going to kind of be inculcated with future-minded conservationism, they need to shed that and be versed in, schooled in the Japanese tradition. This is also a time when more and more Westerners are writing about the Oriental decline thesis. They're looking at the landscape in China as evidence of how once great empires and kingdoms squandered their natural resources, and China is, I think, the case in point. So they're sort of seeing what they want to see, so to speak, in Korea as further evidence, sort of a further case study in what happens when countries and empires fail to make forest conservation and reforestation in particular a strategic imperative. And they are drawing a lesson for the US themselves. I mean, progressive era intellectuals, surveyors, traders are all saying, well, if we be warned, look at China, look at the terrible state of the landscape. If we aren't serious about our conservation of our own resources at home, that's where we're headed. And that was a very powerful argument that was being made by some of the people I write about in the book to folks like Teddy Roosevelt, who were spearheading the conservation movement back in the United States. But yet, to answer your question directly, absolutely, there's a tight linkage between kind of the perceptions of the Korean landscape and a general turning away from China and its influence over Korea.
Great. So we have a couple questions. Our next two questions concern South Korea, really post the creation and immediately preceding the creation of the Republic of Korea in 1948. So I'll start here with a question. Professor Christine Kim from Georgetown, who's joining us. She says, hi, David and Joseph, hello. Great talk. Many questions, but I'll start there with a minor detail. You mentioned that April 3rd served as a tree planting day imposed by the colonial regime. I see the newly established South Korea's own Arbor Day was made a holiday from 1948 onward, even before the establishment of the ROK, Republic of Korea. Did the re-administration have a forestry project that precedes Park Chung-hee's? Also, April 5th seems uncomfortably close to the imperial date.
So I'm not totally sure. I don't know if it's a coincidence or how to explain it, but in the book, I talk about kind of the planning process behind the rollout of Forest Love Day in colonial Korea. And it's a very deliberate choice on the part of the colonial officials and forestry bureaucrats to have the day coincide with the anniversary of the death of Emperor Jeju, the kind of mythological founding emperor of Japan, the progenitor of the Japanese people. So these rituals are framed from the outset as kind of doubling as a form of reverence for Japan's imperial line. And a lot of by the wartime period, they're using them to bow in the direction of the emperor, to recite Kokutai no Hongi, the fundamentals of our national polity. These tree planting rituals are very much kind of repurposed in service of imperial fealty. Why that date carries over, I'm really not so sure. I would think that there would be a distancing going on there, and maybe I'm missing something. That could very well be the case. To your second question, Syngman absolutely had a forestry initiative program in place. It just didn't really go anywhere for a variety of reasons. The nature of the South Korean economy at that moment, the dependency on foreign aid didn't make reforestation is expensive, and it wasn't easy to finance. The flow of urbanization during this period was also a major issue. So there was just a lot of different forces that were conspiring against rapid reforestation, but it's not for lack of trying on the part of Syngman Rhee. There's an essay by a colleague of mine, Lisa Brady, on the reforestation efforts under UNKRA, United Nations Korean Reconstruction Agency, it might be, where she gets into some of these politics and the overall ambitions of reforestation, but they didn't really go anywhere. And it's not until the 1960s with Park Chung-hee that it takes off, but boy, does it take off. And one of the questions is why? I mean, why did Syngman Rhee kind of struggle as much as he did to meaningfully reforest, and why then did Park Chung-hee, why was he able to do it so efficiently and successfully in such a short time span? That's a question for, I suppose, another scholar to take up, but it has a lot to do with his kind of military discipline and military resources that he brought to bear on reforestation, kind of the strong state surveillance apparatus that was put in place to monitor and impose discipline on agrarian society. But it's also the story of an energy revolution. I point this out, I think, in a single sentence. I really wish I had expanded on it in the book. But the shift towards the burning of coal in the domestic sphere is hugely important as far as sparing the forests of the collection of biofuels. And I would venture to say that's one really important way that we can explain the forest miracle under Puck. But I'm also hesitant to call it a miracle. It was not miraculous, suggests it's sent from heaven. It was very deliberate. It was very strategic, and drew upon the lessons that the Japanese colonial state had learned before it. Was there another part of the question? Oh, April 5th seems like an uncomfortably close. That I don't know enough to really speak to. But thank you for the question. Those questions, those are excellent.
Great. And so I missed a question earlier that came into the chat. This is from Nicholas C., one of the students in our UVA Modern Korean History class this semester. And he's asking, how did Japan reconcile its need for industrialized food production with its tradition of environmental reverence?
Its need for industrialized food production?
Yes.
With its need for, sorry, I can't read the question myself. Okay. So
it says, how did Japan reconcile its need for industrialized food production with its tradition of environmental reverence?
Yeah, I don't know where exactly to dive in with that question, because there are a lot of different ways, a lot of different directions that you could take it. I mean, one of the things I'm really trying to do in the book is to dismantle the straw man that just won't blow away. This idea that there is this tradition of environmental reverence, that the Japanese have historically operated in harmony with their surroundings. And I'm far from the first environmental historian to push back against that idea. But I am, I'd say, among one of the first to apply it to the colonial context. So to start, I would say that I don't totally buy the idea that the Japanese have historically had this tradition of environmental reverence. Of course, there are, I know you all hosted Aiki Rotz, just last week. I mean, he can tell you about the Shinto traditions of environment, the kind of the intellectual traditions of environmental thought and conservation, and those are real. That's not to diminish the importance of them, but I also think we need to think more critically about kind of the discursive creation of these ideas about Japan's green thumb, or Japan being an eco-friendly place. The question of food production, though, is a really interesting one. Of course, rice is all important in this context. It's worth pointing out that Korea was a rice basket, not just for the peninsula, but for the archipelago. A good deal of the rice produced in the southern provinces of Korea was shipped to Japan to offset domestic scarcity in the 1910s and 1920s, especially. So these food politics extend beyond the archipelago itself. And maybe that's my answer, is that part of the way that Japan has dealt with its demand at home is to outsource some of the costs and consequences of resource use abroad. Japan has been dependent on landscapes beyond the home islands to provide supplies for a very long time, be it rice or be it timber or fuel. And so this, for me, is just an kind of further underscores what we gain when we take a transnational approach to environmental history and further embed the Japanese archipelago in its broader ecological and regional context.
Great, and thanks, Nick, for your question. So this question is also from, so this is from Amber Bullock, who asked a question earlier, but she asked, after Pak Chung-hee's forest miracle, have the forests been maintained? Was the forest miracle done to mainly have more forests in Korea for more industrial purposes? When Japan did forestry on their own land, they only planted Japanese cypress, which has now become very overgrown. Also, there was an increase in cypress allergies in the population. You were talking about tree allergies earlier. So I'm curious if Korea's had any similar results from Park's forest miracle.
All very interesting questions. Yes, absolutely, the forests have been maintained. Look no further than the 2018 Pyeongchang Olympics, where green Korea was everywhere on display and was, kind of placed front and center in the opening ceremonies. The South Korean government now goes to great lengths to kind of point out its mind-boggling success in reforestation as evidence of its eco-friendly intentions, and to position itself at the vanguard of kind of the global community of sustainable countries, and also to export some of its reforestation expertise abroad. Japan, and I point this out in the conclusion of the book, Japan and South Korea are both kind of jockeying for influence in Southeast Asia as sort of pioneers in green development, and they're dispatching through official developmental assistance and government programs advisors to places like Vietnam and the Philippines to consult on reforestation projects. But I think you could also say to also open up new pathways to gain access to resources in those places. So yes, South Korea remains very much verdant to this day. It has a robust forest service that is active in keeping its forests healthy. It does not deal with the same kind of monocultural issues that you see in Japan. My overall sense is that the forests are probably healthier in South Korea than they are in Japan. Another way to think about this, though, is just the geography itself, the landmass and the population. Part of the problem in besetting forestry in Japan is the population decline. These forests that have historically been maintained by agrarian communities, those communities are disappearing. Their populations are rapidly dwindling. So a lot of the thinning of forest cover that is required, kind of the hands-on community investment that is required to make these forests healthy and profitable, just isn't there in Japan. And you don't quite have that problem in South Korea. So that's one piece of what's at work. The other is the market itself. The Japanese are just structurally so dependent at this point on importing lumber from Southeast Asia and more from Russia, from Siberia, that it's just not profitable to engage in forestry in Japan. It's very expensive to take on industrial logging operations in these steep mountain slopes of Japan. And so fewer communities and local governments and prefectural governments are interested in investing in forestry as an economic enterprise. And that's also a severe problem that you don't see as much in South Korea, though you see it too in certain places. So it's also important to kind of look at the broader structure of the Trans-Pacific timber trade that is at the heart of this as well. I'm just going through your question has a few different parts. Yeah, as far as allergies and whatnot, not that I'm aware of, but there are also contentious politics in South Korea. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture. There's a great deal of resentment between South Korean communities and the Forestry Service, who they see as being kind of the state's hand encroaching on their own economic affairs. There was, for example, there was a controversy surrounding the creation of ski runs in the lead up to the 2018 Winter Olympics. The state kind of commandeered mountain slopes in Gangwon province and cut down allegedly old growth forests to create runs for Olympic athletes to use for 2 weeks of competition. And this was much to the chagrin of local communities and environmentalists who saw this as just being totally short-sighted and irresponsible. So there's a robust environmental movement in South Korea, but also no small measure of antagonism between rural society in South Korea and kind of forestry bureaucrats at the center.
Great. Yeah, thank you for those questions. So next question, this is also from Professor Damon. He asked, Japan has a sort of sacred corner in part related to its forests, the Kii Peninsula. Is there anything like that in Korea?
The first thing that springs to mind, and I don't want to answer this with too much confidence because I imagine there's more complexity than I realize here. But I do know that the forests of Jeju Island have a very special grip on the kind of forest imagination of the Korean people. There's a lot of dynamics at work in terms of the relationship between Jeju Island and the mainland itself. But there are certain types of forest. What is it? Do you remember, Joseph? Is it Gojatwang?
I don't remember the term, but I know what you're referring to.
There's a special kind of category of forests that the people of the Jeju Islanders have traditionally groomed and protected, that is supposed to kind of harbor special, that is just invested and imbued with spiritual significance. But it's also more and more becoming an eco-tourist destination. And so that's placing new pressures on these forests, and kind of the developmental interests are moving to Jeju. So that's one thing that springs to mind. I don't know that it's perfectly comparable with the Kii Peninsula, but there are, and I imagine there are lots of other examples. I don't know, Joseph, if anything, you know the Korean landscape better than I do. Can you think of anything?
Well, first, I just wanted to say, I had to check this really quick, but yeah, it's Gojawa. You had that right, the name of those forests in Jeju Island. I mean, mountains, right? Mountains occupy such a sacred place in the sort of Korean, spiritual landscape in terms of geomancy, but also to the present day in terms of, tourism and just being seen as like this repository of Korean essence, right? And mountains by nature in Korea are forested, right? Like you don't say forest fire in Korea, you say a mountain fire, right? Sanbun. And so, the association between sacred mountains such as Mount Gungang, which is now in North Korea, just a little north of the DMZ, or Mount Baekdu on the Sino-North Korean border. I think the sacredness of those mountains is inextricably intertwined with the forests that grow on their sides. I think that's one else important to comment too.
Yeah. most definitely.
So do we have any, we just have 8 more minutes until we have to say goodbye, but do we have any more questions? There's been some great questions coming in so far. Then you might humor me one more question.
Of course.
So you were talking earlier about this idea in a certain chapter about righting the forests, about granting rights to forests to people, usually settlers or colonial corporations that would engage in afforestation and planting trees, and how this was violent and there was protests. I wonder if you could give us briefly an example of one of these kind of violent episodes and what that might tell us about the colonial forestry project. I know you saw one in your book, so hoping you
I mean, I go in the book, I devote an entire section to really kind of mapping out one particularly large scale protest in Tanchon, this relatively mountainous area. But that comes later. I mean, that's in the 1930s, more or less, late 1920s into the 30s. But these kind of skirmishes take off immediately upon Japanese colonial rule. There are some great stories about, well, great might not be the right way to characterize them, but there are some gripping accounts of the clashes between forest surveyors in as early as 1907, 1908, before even annexation, and being met with rock-throwing local residents who see them really, this is their first encounter with the colonial state. I mean, and that's one of the things that I think it's worth recalling here, that for a lot of rural society, their first and perhaps only encounter with colonial rule comes in the form of forest rangers and surveyors. So the operatives, the bureaucrats, and the just employees of the Bureau of Forestry are kind of battle hardened by this. They go in, they recognize that these upland areas are spaces of real resistance and subversion, and it's not unusual for them to go with armed guards into these places. So for very good reason, they recognize the hostility of local residents who, mistakenly or not, see these surveyors as kind of the first step in wresting control of their ancestral woodlands. To start, I would point you to this steady string of incidents involving kind of Korean farming communities just lobbing rocks and taking hoes and whatever weapons they could find, just to kind of scare off forest surveyors, even before the survey unfurls. But by the 1920s and into the 1930s, once there's a much broader kind of organizational apparatus behind the kind of nationalist movement in Korea, once in the wake of this kind of shift towards cultural rule, there's a somewhat of a loosening of the possibilities of political organization. These efforts to push back against the state find new channels and new organizational discipline, and they become much more formidable. So later into the book, I write about this this incident of a violent uprising in Tanchon that isn't this spontaneous kind of spasmodic response to the state. To understand it, you need to look at a number of rural, semi-official rural organizations, socialist groups, intellectuals, red peasant unions. They're all kind of coming together to unite these different communities in an effort to have more of a say over the course of rural affairs and environmental governance. And so this one case study that I write about, the Unquiet Woods of Tanchon, I think it's called, offer a reminder of kind of the broader political architecture that takes place that develops over the 1930s and gives these movements new potency. That is ultimately foreclosed by the shift towards wartime. Whatever kind of opening liberalization might have taken place under colonial rule is very quickly those kind of contracted and done away with as war ramps up on the continent. So yeah, I suppose the short answer is read chapter 6 of the book.